Our speaker tonight has been actively involved in conservation in Africa for almost 20 years. He has held various strategic positions in conservation areas and consulting businesses with a key focus on protected area development and management. He has been operating in the NGO space for the past decade, and even today, the 9th of May, he has been involved in the rescue and translocation of many species. These species include elephants, rhinos, and cheetahs, amongst others. It is an honor to introduce you to Dereck Milburn, who will be speaking about filling the gaps, the critical role of conservation NGOs in South Africa. Dereck, the floor is now yours.
Great. Thank you. Aisha, thank you once again very much for the opportunity, and Johan and your team. We're very privileged to be part of your series. And good evening to the listeners. I'm currently in the Limpopo province of South Africa, and I'm looking forward to sharing some interesting developments in the conservation landscape in South Africa, and hopefully learning a bit more from yourselves as well. So thank you for the opportunity. This evening, I have a few projects that I'd like to share. And when we started putting the presentation together, we really wanted to focus on the growing need for conservation NGO support in South Africa. And I know Johan introduced it as Africa, but I think really the focus tonight is going to be on South Africa and partly in Southern Africa. And I think it's a key issue at the moment, where our resources in state-owned reserves are being depleted from a financial point of view, from a capacity point of view. Resources are being allocated or reallocated to other core functions within government, and conservation is often getting the drips and drabs of funding that is available. And what we're finding as an NGO is that there is a growing and a consistently growing need for conservation NGOs to support in South Africa. And we believe that we have unlocked certain legal channels, which will hopefully be a catalyst for other NGOs to be involved. And really tonight, the golden thread with all the projects that I'm going to be sharing with you we've done is really the golden thread will be about how we can forge better relationships with governments and other private sector parties in Southern Africa and South Africa, and obviously with the NGOs, and because collaboration is key in this space. So that's just really a brief introduction on what we're looking at this evening. Just a bit about our organization, WeWild Africa. We are a subsidiary of the Aspinall Foundation based in the United Kingdom. The Aspinall Foundation has been going for about 40 years now, and the South African entity, WeWild Africa, has been going on for about 5 years. So we've been quite busy from a global point of view in projects that we've undertaken. Historically, the Aspinall Foundation has focused on rewilding captive animals, specifically for the purposes of supporting and supplementing endangered species populations throughout the world, and also landscape protection. They've been in Congo for about 30 years now, specifically protecting landscapes in Congo, and then more recently in Gabon, where between those countries we manage close on 1 million acres specifically for the purposes of gorilla protection. And then just moving east, we've worked in Tanzania with releasing eastern black rhino. We're one of the biggest breeders of eastern black rhino outside of Africa. We have 2 parks in Kent in the United Kingdom where we breed endangered species, specifically for supporting populations outside of, within their home ranges. And then we do a lot of work with the lemur populations in Madagascar. We've done some work with cheetah populations in Somaliland, and then obviously we've released over 400 primates back into Indonesia, Java, and those regions. And we've done European bison back to Romania. So we've worked with a number of different species and a number of different parts of the world. So that's just to give you really a holistic view of the areas that we've worked in. And obviously tonight we're going to be focusing more on South Africa. Our key focus areas specifically is there's really 3 things that we really focus on as an NGO, and I think that differentiates us slightly from many other NGOs in South Africa that have quite key focuses on a specific sector within the conservation landscape. but we're quite diverse in the projects that we implement. So firstly, protection of landscapes, which I'm going to be talking about. Pretty much half of my presentation this evening is going to be about protection of landscapes and one of the key projects we're busy with in South Africa at the moment. Then our contribution to endangered species wherever we can, and then emergency rescue translocation, which is becoming a critical issue in South Africa, at the moment. And we're getting calls almost on a daily basis from a variety of different reserves, many state-owned reserves, requesting for support in helicopter support or capture support or veterinary support, just simply because the resources are no longer there to help an animal in these protected areas, especially when they break out or they need veterinary support, dehorning operations. So like I mentioned, the golden thread of the evening is really going to be about how we would really like to see conservation going forward, working with other NGOs in the landscape, and working with government to really achieve much greater results as conservation resources become less and less in the state-owned reserves. The first project I'm going to talk about this evening is our most recent development in the country. And when I say the most recent development in the country, it's we've been working on this for about 2 years now. And we signed the agreement about 2 months ago. And this agreement is with the Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency. And we signed a 25-year collaboration or co-management agreement for the improved development, management, and rewilding of the Loskop Dam Nature Reserve. And this is a groundbreaking agreement in the country. And what we are seeing is that a lot of the donor funding at the moment is going into other parts of Africa, which rightfully so, all of these projects deserve funding. But what we're finding is that there's a lot of Southern African NGOs that are generating funds, and they're pushing these funds into the northern parts of Africa. And I think that is largely due to the fact that South African reserves have historically been fairly well funded, fairly well managed, but we're finding these reserves are slipping further and further away from being well managed. And EWT recently did a report on the state of protected areas, state-owned protected areas in South Africa, and it was quite a damning report in terms of where we are as a country for protected areas. So I think this agreement is really groundbreaking in the sense that we now have proven that it is possible to sign these sorts of co-management agreements in the country, and hopefully this will generate more funding for the long-term protection and management of protected areas in South Africa. If you look at many of the projects and parks at the moment, there was a big news briefing a few weeks ago about Shishlu and Pelosi Park that recently dehorned their entire rhino population, and that's evidence that state-owned reserves require support. I think that was the last thing that Isambelo necessarily wanted to do, but they were really left with no other options. And that just shows that these protected areas, historically well-funded protected areas, are just really on their knees. So as NGOs, we need to step up and really start supporting governments on a more long-term basis. And what we're trying to do here is really show that the legal frameworks are actually there to allow long-term government support. And historically, that hasn't really happened in South Africa. So it took us about 2 years to work with the Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency to sign this agreement with the Loskop Dam Nature Reserve. And I'm just going to flick over to the map. So Loskop Dam Nature Reserve is located in the Mpumalanga province of South Africa. It's basically east-northeast of Johannesburg, a mere 2-hour drive from the airport. So as an economic driver, it's a very important project. But at the same time, it forms part of a much bigger nature conservation cluster. And we've been really working with Mpumalanga Park for a long time on interventions, strategic interventions, moving elephants with them, rhinos, dehorning rhinos with them. When there are breakouts in reserves, we often support them on that. And we started thinking about, how can we start forging a longer-term partnership with the provincial management authority of this nature. We've worked with many other provincial nature conservation authorities as well, Isambelo, KZN Wildlife, Eastern Cape Parks, Cape Nature. We've also worked up into Mozambique, Zim Parks, quite successfully, but we've now really started looking at the long-term game. So Mpumalanga Parks then said, well, why don't we look at a much bigger cluster? Because we can look at Loskop in isolation. Loskop is about 23,500 hectares. So it's on a scale point of view, it's not as large as many of the parks within Africa, but on a South African scale, It is one of the larger parks in the region. And especially in a South African context, it is quite a large park. But Mpumalanga said, well, look, guys, if we are going to be looking at this bigger project, we should start, looking at in a cluster context. So they've now, in the 25-year agreement that we have signed with them, have said that we should also start looking at investment into 3 other reserves, including Mapusa Nature Reserve, which you see just basically in the middle of the map there. Just above that, you've got SS Kosana Nature Reserve, and then just to the left of that, you've got Mdala Nature Reserve. So we basically signed a 25-year agreement to look at Luscop Dam Nature Reserve as our core area, but then trying to drive investment into this total block of, it's probably in total about 300,000 hectares if you had to add all that land up. But obviously small steps makes it happen. But we are trying to drive as much investment into the area as possible. So like I mentioned, we need to act now as conservation agencies in South Africa. And the reason for that is that many of the reserves are literally on their knees and at a point of complete collapse. And I think many of the management agents and management authorities within these reserves really want private sector investments. And it's just about how do we make that private sector investment work in our provincial nature reserves. In many of the reserves that we've worked with, and I'd prefer not to mention their names at the moment, but many of the provincial nature reserves that we worked with, the management team on the ground is desperate for support. They're desperate for interventions. And it's fine to get the piecemeal interventions of, de-warning a few runners where we can and fixing a fence here and there. But what we require in South Africa is very much similar to what is happening in the rest of Africa at the moment, is really getting these long-term donors involved and really making a big impact on these reserves, or alternatively, we're going to be losing many of these protected areas, not to mention our expansion targets. South Africa, just like everybody else on the continent, I guess, has expansion targets. And if you're not protecting what we've got at the moment, we can't even imagine about the potential for expansion and how we're going to unlock that expansion. So expansion is quite key to what we're trying to achieve as part of this project as well. And within Luscop itself, it is a pangolin conservation hotspot. There's been quite a few pangolins released there already, and it's been quite successful there. It's also got the Middelburg cycad, which is a critically endangered species. There's only a few hundred of them left, and they only occur within the Olifants River Valley. So there's these critical species that if we don't jump in now, there's a very good chance that those species will be lost. To give you an idea, when we took on the reserve, they've only got 2 working vehicles and 6 rangers. So we are now actively trying to support with more rangers, more vehicles, and actually making a big impact. So we signed the agreement on the 22nd of February for the 25-year period. We've already upgraded all the tourism roads in the reserve. People are complaining about the tourism roads. They couldn't drive in the reserve. So immediately there's been an impact of the upgrade of the roads, which means there's an immediate income injection for the reserve itself, because now more tourists can access with smaller vehicles and not requiring low-range 4x4s just to access the main roads in the reserve. But what was required was really a government that was forward-thinking. And what I can tell you is that the Mpumalanga government has been exceptionally proactive. They've really driven this process exceptionally well, and they've been open-minded. The legal framework, and I think the big issue why private sector investment of this nature hasn't happened in the country to date is because of the fact that there hasn't really been a legal framework to do it. You'd have to go out on tender, and so we've really had to work with the legal departments, both ours and theirs, to make it work. And we think we've now got a model that we can share with other parks and with other NGOs to really make this work. So that's exactly what we're trying to achieve here. On the one side, we're working with Luscop, but on the other side, we're hoping that this becomes a catalyst for other NGOs to get involved. We would love to work with other NGOs to get involved, and be happy to share our agreement and show them more on how we got this right. And hopefully we can get more reserves, with better investment. Just an overview of the Luscop Dam Nature Reserve. It's got about a 3,500 hectare dam on it, which obviously lends itself to significant tourism opportunities, obviously. But there's a very good variety of habitats on the property. You've got high-felt grasslands coming into your low-felt areas, so the diversity is very good. And then also one of the key issues that we looked at as part of this project was really expansion. And I'm just going to flick back to this map, because when we looked at a project, and as an organization, we really wanted to sink our teeth into one significant project in South Africa, a land-based project, so that we could really make an impact. because taking 2 or 3, I guess, we can try our best, but, with our budget and the available funds that we have at this stage, really want to make an impact in one specific area. But then we said that we must be able to scale this area. So we're looking at the moment at Loskop, which is about 23,500 hectares. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll be driving that up to about 50,000 hectares with land that we've already started negotiating for, next to the reserve, and also to the southwest of the reserve and north of the reserve, which will then link us up to Mabusa and then start pushing us up north. So scalability of this thing was really important for us, so that we could really make an impact in one space, and secure those areas. So that's a reserve as it stands at the moment. That little block of land in the middle there is privately owned. The rest of it is owned by state and communities. So interestingly, we've got 3 communities that are part of this reserve. They were part of the land claim process in South Africa, and those properties have successfully been restituted to those communities. So close on 20% of the park has been claimed, and the properties have been restituted. Settlement agreements have been signed with these landowners, and they've signed off on this 25-year agreement as well, and they will be sharing in the profits from all income derived from the reserve. So all in all, it's been very successful in terms of engaging with key stakeholders, and we've been really surprised and really thankful in the way that the communities have just really absorbed this and just worked with us so well, with all the road upgrades, and they've really been attending meetings. So we're really hopeful that we can make an impact on their livelihoods as well. Some of the communities, there's only 19 or 20 households, but the Mamarunro CPA, that's about 1,000 households that we need to work with there. So, it's all about how do we make an impact on those landowners that now own land within the reserve. The reality of the situation is that once they claim land within the reserve, that land has to remain conservation land forever. So they can't use it for any other land use purpose. At the same time, they've got to derive benefits. And historically, those benefits haven't been forthcoming. So there's been a lot of conflict between Mpumalanga and the community, which has now been resolved. We are clearing some of the debt that MTPA owed to these communities, just so that we can really start on a ground zero basis, that we can start on a fresh relationship with all 3 parties. When I say all 3 parties, the CPAs, ourselves, and Mpumalanga. And then hopefully that'll also then generate more opportunities for other NGOs to get involved wherever we possibly can get them involved. So like I mentioned, there's already key species within the reserve that require protection. There's a healthy population of white rhino on the reserve, a very healthy population of leopard. There's a ground hornbill release program going on there with the Mabula ground hornbill project. Lots of crocodile work going on, the cycads, and then a host of other endangered species, which I'm just showing the list there. So as you can see, this landscape is quite critical, and what we're trying to do is really work with other NGOs to unlock more funding for species-specific purposes. And this is why I say that there's a lot of opportunity for NGOs to really collaborate. And there's a few NGOs that we're working with at the moment, African wildlife vets that are constantly providing veterinary support for these projects. Like I mentioned, the Mabula ground hornbill project that have been there for many, many years. The pangolin specialist group. There's all these NGOs that are really putting a lot of value into this reserve, but without, I guess, an umbrella organization coming in and looking at the bigger picture and really providing the protection for these species, I think the future looks quite dire. So that's why these long-term agreements are so important for conservation into the long term, to really make it possible for mandates of other NGOs to really get stuck in and make sure that whatever they're investing is secure in the future. There's no point in delivering species like pangolins to a reserve that can't afford to fix a fence. So that's important that we get that framework correct, and really that becomes the chassis for other funding mechanisms to really plug into making this bigger picture work. So our intention is for the long term to make Loskop Dam Nature Reserve and the surrounding areas a Big 5 game reserve, for a number of reasons, but obviously from an ecological perspective to really compete in the ecosystems within that landscape. Then also from an economic driver, being a 2-hour drive from Johannesburg on the way to Kruger National Park, it's a perfect stopover point. And like I showed you, we need to show tangible commitments to these communities around us, that they get benefits from this reserve. They've been talking way too long about getting benefits. without anything in their bank accounts. So we really need to change that, and that's one of the ways we're going to do it. And then obviously other key species, cheetah, definitely on our radar. There is a high population of leopard though, but we do believe that once you bring the lion populations in, that should also bring in the balance back for the bigger cats. And then the meso predator numbers are quite low, which we're still doing studies and research on as to why those numbers are quite low. But just to give you an idea of, what our plans are from an introduction point of view going forward, just to complete the circles there. And then obviously we're looking at black rhino as a key species as well. And that's going to be, hopefully in the next 5 years, we're going to be upgrading the fencing. At the moment, the fencing allows for buffalo and white rhino, but we're going to be upgrading the entire park to allow for these additional species to be introduced. From an expansion point of view, for those of you who don't know, South Africa's got a provincial protected area expansion plan strategy, and then there's obviously the national protected area expansion strategy. So you can see basically the vertical lines are the national protected area expansion strategy, and the horizontal lines are the provincial protected area expansion strategy. And that's based on a number of different layers, which all come together to really inform the land use planning and the spatial planning in these expansion strategies. But as you can see, there are critical areas that have already been identified on both the provincial and the provincial expansion strategies. And we really focused on that and zoomed in on that to see how best we could start with this expansion. Because like I mentioned, our 25-year agreement really looks at the bigger cluster. So we've already started talking to a lot of the landowners around the reserve, so call it the Southwest. Those are private landowners. We're at short finals of signing a 50-year lease with those landowners, and it's 12,000 hectares. Then just north of Loskop, that is Prince Matebe in the Matebe Kingdom. They're willing to give between 10 and 15,000 hectares to us to link Loskop to Mabusa. Then we've got about a short corridor of about 500 meters wide, 500 meters wide corridor that links Mabusa to SS Kosana. And then the Ndebele Kingdom that will give us a land between SS Kosana and Mdola Nature Reserve. So in many cases, corridor projects conceptually look really good. But we thought we have to drill down deeper to see if this is even possible. And the reality of the situation is that all of these stakeholders are very keen to partner and give their land to conservation, which is amazing to see in this landscape where there's cattle. And this is real. The Ndebele King advisors went with us and showed us where we can put the fences up. Mabusa is largely community owned. SS Kosana, it's owned by MTPA and managed by MTPA. Mdola is completely owned by the communities. And all of these communities have basically said they're in and they want this thing to work. But at the same time, you've got to manage expectations. So we just wanted to really see what the opportunities are and then start breaking these down into fundable chunks in the project. So that's basically the general concept of where we are. And it just shows that what the snowball effect of a long-term agreement can have on an area, which has historically not really happened in South Africa. And I think when I say it hasn't happened, I'm pretty sure there's been many projects where there's been tactical intervention, security, or whatever it might be in some of the reserves, but there's never really been a co-management agreement of this nature. And I think this is really evidence of what is possible. So the private landowners at the bottom of the map there have said, well, if you guys are able to sign a 25-year agreement with government, we're more than happy to sign a 50-year agreement with you to take up properties forward. So we're basically going to be taking their properties on, fencing them as well, managing them. And then obviously that comes with commercial opportunities, which we can then try and get this park self-sustaining as best as we possibly can. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what Loskop is all about. And we're quite thrilled about it. And we really hope that this now unlocks further investment into other parks in South Africa and really brings in more investment from other NGOs. And we need to collaborate. We have to work together to make these projects work. So we really look forward to working with other NGOs and playing the critical role that we need to play in securing state-owned reserves for future generations. That's just an idea of the expansion area to the southwest of Loskop Dam. It's a beautiful area, very much untouched, pristine area. And there's literally thousands and thousands of hectares around this area that looks just like this. That's why it's so important to protect it. So that's basically, in a nutshell, where we are with Loskop. And I just want to briefly go over some of the other tactical interventions that we have done with other NGOs and government departments. to try our best to support governments wherever we possibly can and play a key function in the conservation landscape. So we really focus on a variety of different species. It's not that we only look at rhinos or elephants and iconic species. We try our best to support government wherever it is required. So I just literally picked 3 projects here that reflects a bit about that. So the top project there, there's 2 vultures. That was an SPCA case. They had to be confiscated. The SPCA in question and the provincial government in question didn't have the capacity or the budget to do that. So we then facilitated that, and we actually managed to get one of the birds flying again. It was they were both double their body weights. It was a whiteback vulture and a Cape vulture. The owner thought they were both Cape vultures. So yeah, eventually we got their body weights down. We actually got one flying again. That is just a way that we jumped in and really made it work. But it also takes government and other NGOs to work together to make that work. And then at the same time, we would do quite a lot of work with government departments with leopards. Leopards is a critical issue at the moment in South Africa, and there's a lot of politics around leopards and you know what we need to do with the growing leopard population. But it is something that we really need to all work together. There's a lot of organizations pulling in different directions, but there has to be a regional strategy for leopard conservation because there are too many problem leopards, nowhere to go with them. So we really need to work together to really come together with a strategy that government is happy with and that we're all happy with. Because there's a lot of different opinions, but somewhere we need to find common ground. And then just on the right there, we also work quite in the captive industry where properties are closing down, and often it becomes government's problem. They're just like, the owners are, we out, and then often the animals are dying, then dire straits. Then you know somebody needs to move in and help these animals. So that's I think a key gap in this, I would call it the welfare space, not necessarily the conservation space. Although we release as many of these animals as we can, there's a critical need in that space for NGOs to play a bigger role in supporting the SPCAs and provincial governments that just get basically tossed these curveballs almost on a monthly basis with many of these properties shutting down. A big thing that we've done in the last few years is really supported pangolin organizations, just with capacity, helicopters, vets. That picture at the bottom right there was in Mpumalanga Parks. They got a pangolin that needed to get to Hoedspruit, but there was a lockdown, taxi strike. They couldn't get out of the city, so we flew the pangolin out. But that, you know, we get a phone call now, and we basically provide a solution within the next hour or two. So our philosophy is that we've got to provide a solution within a 24-hour period wherever we can, and that requires an immediate slush fund. So you know, we're always trying to raise funds to have a war chest available, and 100% of those funds goes to these sorts of projects. So these are just small interventions. There's obviously NGOs out there that are really good at pangolin rehabilitation, pangolin release, and we just really provide the nuts and bolts to really get the pangolins from the point of where they've either been confiscated or they're in an electric fence to the pangolin specialists. And that is a significant gap at the moment, and not just with pangolins, but with many other species as well, where they often just get put down because there is no way of getting them from point A to point B, because often there's just no logistical network. So working together, there's a real need to facilitate those interventions. Obviously, rhino poaching is a significant issue. I don't need to go into too much detail there, but the NGO support that is required on this fight at the moment is significant. We're constantly removing bullets out of rhinos, and provincial conservation agencies simply cannot continue on the basis that they are if we're going to keep our rhino populations going, and we need to provide more support on this basis. So we've provided on our ongoing support dehorning operations, and there's a lot more to be done to really get the numbers up to where we need them. We've also just recently partnered with African Parks on a project with them, which I think will be announced next week, which we're very excited about, with a large-scale rewilding project there. But we'll need to jump in and really start making a significant hands-on impact, and providing our provincial conservation agencies with the support that they require on the rhino conservation approach. The top left picture there is a last rhino that was removed from a reserve in a province in South Africa. There was a number of rhinos on this property, and that was literally the last one. And we were called at point 99 to come and get the last rhino off that property. And it's just sad that they didn't call us on rhino number 10, where we could have moved 10 or 20 rhinos off when they realized they were in dire straits. So often it's just about getting access to the people that make the decisions, that they can be aware that there are organizations out there that are willing to provide tangible support to these areas. Obviously providing tracking support where we can, but there's a significant need in the space that we need to start communicating better. Elephants is a critical thing in South Africa at the moment, or Southern Africa, and we're constantly providing that support to move elephants from areas where they're broken out of reserves or there's just too many of them. The specific operation in question was in southern Mozambique. This elephant population, and we worked with Mozambique Wildlife Alliance and a few other NGOs with this. The specific elephant group killed somebody, and they were about to be put down. And we managed to mobilize some funding and a team, and we moved them to Zanav National Park. The picture at the bottom was the elephant that broke out of Kruger onto the R44 outside Hoedspruit. So from big operations, which got significant funding, to operations where we just need to chase elephants back into protected areas, this is the sort of scale that government agencies require at the moment. And I think, again, it's about working with other NGOs. Just as an example, I was chatting to an NGO yesterday, and just explaining some of the situations that we're dealing with at the moment. And they weren't even aware of it, a lot of the international NGOs. So it's about getting the messaging right, telling the stories that we need to tell to really start making an impact in these operations. And then there's obviously genetic interventions. So this operation specifically, the Tembe elephants are well known for their large tusks. And we thought that it would be a good idea and a good opportunity for us to actually try and infuse these genetics into other reserves in South Africa, in case for whatever reason we lose those genetics in the Tembe Elephant Park in northern KZN. We thought it would be good to actually infuse these genetics into other reserves in the country. So again, these are planned operations which you can actually plan a budget for going forward. So we've moved these elephants into a number of different reserves in the country, including Pinda, Somkanda, and a few other reserves. And hopefully now we'll get more of these tuskers, showing their faces in the years to come in other reserves throughout the country. So that's, again, it's a strategic function that we're playing with Ezenville KZN Wildlife. Tembe's got too many elephants at this stage, and there's many reserves that want bulls with larger tusks. So it's a good way. It works for both reserves. But again, it wouldn't work without support from private sector and NGOs. So again, if you look at the branding on the truck there, that one organization is a business. It's a private company in the UK that provided funding. So it's about private sector input. So we've been fairly successful with this project for the last 3 to 4 years. It's an annual project. We do this every single year, and we move a few bulls every year and a few family groups as well. We were the first organization to capture family groups out of Tembe. And this is one of the bulls that was going to be shot. We worked with the Eastern Cape province with this. Again, the government didn't have the resources or the place to take the elephant to. They had issued a hunting permit to basically go and destroy the animal. And within about 2 hours, we managed to find the funding and a place to take the elephant. And within about 48 hours, the elephant was loaded and in a safe space in a reserve. And obviously, it's not always possible. Often elephants get destroyed and there's just not enough time to manage the situation. But where we can, there is definitely an alternative. And it's about providing that alternative, which is so key. And like I mentioned, this private sector, the captive sector is also becoming a massive, massive challenge in the country, where NGOs really need to step up and try and help support government in many of these cases. Most of these places need to be shut down or they're already defunct. But now it's about what happens to those animals from there. So this was just one operation where we moved 38 animals out of a single property. And we had to find different places to take all these animals to, ethical places, and where we could rewild, we actually sent animals back into the wild. And then our last aspect of what we do is the management and contribution, or rather contribution to endangered species. That's throughout the world. I'll just mention a few here. So taking animals from captivity where we possibly can and putting them back into the wild, they're actually making a difference to conservation. So these 2 cheetahs specifically came from the United Kingdom. They were tested, the genetics were tested, and they were found to be completely off the chart when it came to the relatedness to the South African populations. And we therefore thought it was a good idea to bring this these two brothers into South Africa to infuse their genetics into the system. So we put them into a 400-hectare area, and they basically taught themselves how to hunt. And then from there, they moved out into an 8,000-hectare area when they were self-sustaining. And now they've produced close on 12, yeah, it's about 12 cubs now that they've produced. And we've done this with a few other cheetahs as well, coming from Canada. Cheetahs playing in the snow in Canada. 2 months later, hunting impala in Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe's cheetah population is also dismal at the moment. They need supplementation. And again, it's about bringing new genetics into the system. So you got basically, you know, we were in the country for about 2 months. We released them into the bigger reserve, and we didn't feed them once. They were self-sustaining from day one, which is quite significant. And then obviously we've got a local strategy where we're constantly removing animals between different reserves, and it's not all about the big stuff. For example, Luskop needs meso predators. The top right, we moved 12 size-striped jackals to Gorongosa from South Africa, because Gorongosa just doesn't have size-striped jackals. Punda needed black-back jackals, so we took them black-back jackals. So it's about the small stuff as well, which often people are forgetting about at the moment. And it's all about rhinos, it's about the elephants. But our local strategy is about all species, where it is required and where they're actually making a difference. So it's not just about translocation, it's about where we're translocating these animals to make a big difference. We've done a lot of work with crocodiles, tracking captive release crocodiles, the impact they have on systems, and that data has been quite positive. Yeah, so we're continuing to test this and see what the future of captive crocodiles hold, because there are literally thousands and thousands of crocodiles in captivity, which eventually something will need to happen with, because the leather price has just dropped dramatically. Black-footed cats, the same thing. We're busy with the release process of black-footed cats in Luskop Dam. Again, government really wanted to do it, didn't have the capacity, didn't have the funding to do it, so we're supporting them on that. And that we've, just to give you an idea, we've probably invested about 600,000 rand into this project in the last 2-3 years, which government wouldn't necessarily have done. So it's really about finding these smaller projects to really sink your teeth into, and then working with them on establishing new disease-free buffalo populations in reserves, which can take, you know, trying to make those small differences wherever we can, and then eventually moving buffalo from these reserves back into Luskop, where we can breed with them again. So yeah, that's basically where we are at the moment as an organization, and I think where as a golden thread where NGOs can really pull together and make a big difference in the conservation space in South Africa. And you know, we believe that charity starts at home, and you know, I think South Africa really desperately needs the help right now, and we need to step in and really make that difference.
Thank you for sharing this with us. And thank you, because we know you're working today as well with the translocation. So thank you so much for taking the time out and for sharing what
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
I am going to open the floor to questions, because there are some questions in the chat. I'm going to start with the latest one. So this is from Paul Andre de Georges, who wants to know: an important role the NGOs can play is to identify and give scholarships to youth from rural areas to study nature conservation at Tshwane University that provides practical hands-on training in the management of the habitat and wildlife. When he was based there, he had a program called Project Noah that brought youth from across Africa living in rural areas where wildlife was important ecologically and economically. It was funded by the international hunting community, but slowly died. The African NGOs, including those in South Africa, should push the international donors, for example, USAID, World Bank, DFID, GTZ, for the continuation of such scholarships in South Africa and across the subcontinent. Thus, the African NGO should consider teaming with TUT's Department of Nature Conservation. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Dereck.
I'm also a proud product of TUT. 100% agree with what you're saying. And yeah, I think there's definitely potential there. And you know, I think the education part is key. And I know, I think it's Professor Ogilvy will be very proud to see that comment. But Yeah, from our point of view, we are very focused on that. We were actually talking about it today and how we're going to link schools in the United Kingdom with schools around Lusco. So there's obviously quite well of schools in the United Kingdom that have got good budgets, and they can play a significant role for schools in South Africa. So it's about trying to link those schools up, and then also where do the children go from the schools and what is the next step. So that's how we're going to try and link it. But I think it's once something is tangible, it's always what we've found is raising support for these scholarships and with anything in these conservation landscapes is about making it tangible and accessible to donors. So if children in the UK can partner with children in South Africa and maybe come and visit once or twice a year and see what these schools, because I think they've got no idea what our children deal with and what our students deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that insight will change their lives forever, and it will change the lives of the children in South Africa. But we are actually looking at that now. We've identified a few schools. There's at least 5 of them that we've identified and are already working with. And hopefully that will then just organically grow into not just scholarships for the school programs, but obviously growing, scholarships for the, for students going into conservation, because it's desperately needed. With these landscapes come management roles. And believe it or not, it's really difficult to find really strong people at the moment. So there's definitely a skills lack in this space. So I 100% agree with what you're saying, and it's definitely something we need to consider.
Thank you very much, Dereck, and thank you for your question, Paul. So there's a hand raised. So before I go back to the chat, to Llewellyn.
Yeah, great, Dereck. Thanks very much. That was absolutely superb. I just want, well, first of all, it's a bit of bragging. The report by the EWT, the Wildlife Society, Lowveld, we were quite instrumental in putting money forward for that report, and we're quite proud of the fact that it was a very significant report that was brought out with respect to PAs and their status, and also where to go with them. So that's really great. But the question I have for you is those 2 cheetahs, those 2 brothers that were brought in from Britain, their genomes brought into the local South African population. What were their histories?
So they came initially, I think they were 6 or 7 generation cheetahs within the stud book within Europe. So obviously all captive cheetahs in Europe came from Southern African source or South African sources. A lot of them came from Dereck. But what our whole theory behind it is that they've been out of the system for so long that their genetics are different to what we're currently getting in South Africa, just because they've been out of the system for so long. And that's a theory behind it. But all of the captive cheetahs throughout Europe and America, they've all come from the single sources of either Hesk or Dereck or whoever else, whichever other traders now have sold to zoos in Europe and wherever else they've gone to. But historically, it's always been those 2 sources. So it's a good question, because it's like, well, wow, they're different because they've all come from South Africa. But our theory and the philosophy around it is that they've just been out of the system for so long that they just haven't bred with the current local populations. Because you've obviously got the Volt cluster genetics that you're working with, you've got the Hesk, and then you've obviously got the wild population, which could be a combination of those. And our cheetahs were off the charts on all 3 of those clusters that we found.
Yeah. So the follow-up question is that so that would have been 6 or 7 generations, you say, that were established within those European conditions before these 2 brothers were born and brought back to South Africa.
Yeah.
How many generations? 6 or 7? Did you say 7?
Yeah, I think I'll check. I can check it for you, and I can give you that info. I'm not 100% sure on the figures at the moment, but it'll probably be around say 4, 5, or 6. Yeah, but it was a few. It wasn't that we took them out of South Africa and brought them back. That was definitely not the case, because they were not really achieving much. That work was done before we actually decided to bring them back. So it wasn't that we just transported them and then let them breed there and then brought them back, because otherwise you might as well just get animals from Hesk, which you've done previously, for rewilding purposes.
And what conditions were they kept under within those environments in Europe?
Okay, so again, it's a good question, and it's also about where we take them to. So obviously within Europe, they were kept in a fairly small enclosure. They were obviously given the best care possible within those conditions. They were, I mean, it's not that they were starving, and it was definitely not a rescue mission. Again, it was more about the genetics, and it's from our point of view as an organization, we believe that any animal has got the chance to be in the wild, and we should give that animal the chance to be in the wild. But at the same time, we looked at the climate where we've seen those animals too. So we sent them to Mount Canterbury in the Eastern Cape, in Kaapstad, and that was quite cold conditions. That actually snowed up there as well, so the cheetahs are quite used to snow. So it's not like we sent them to extremely hot conditions, and that we actually did put quite a lot of thought and effort into finding the right conditions to send them to. But where they came from was a fairly small area, probably about 0.5 hectare, where they were maintained.
Yeah, look, I'd like to ask a few other things. So maybe could I have your email address, and then
Absolutely.
I don't know if I picked it up. If you can just put in the chat,
Sure.
and then I'll contact
Please.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure, Dr. Dereck. Thank you.
There's a two-part question from Kuena Cholo, who is the Director of Biodiversity Transformation and Beneficiation within the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. I'm going to start with the first question, but Kuena, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. If you would like to jump in at any point, then please do. Please raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So the first part is, I would like to check up with you. There's a community in KZN that has more than 10,000 hectare for expansion to add to their current 12,000 hectare community conservation area. I think that's a statement. And then the second part, or the second question is, your key focus areas miss the people, it's inverted commas, conservation in this democratic dispensation cannot succeed without involvement, empowerment, and beneficiation of the people. The current policy realm in South Africa recognizes and acknowledges that with the current white paper on the biodiversity conservation and sustainable use and many other subsidiary policies. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Dereck. You muted.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, obviously from a statement point of view, I think it's great that, I mean, any land for conservation is wonderful. And obviously they've got the support that they need to have that 10,000 hectares or the 12,000 hectare area that they've currently got. And that's wonderful news. And it'd be good to know which reserve that is. It would have been nice to know the name so we can actually talk about it, because I think I might know. But, from a support point of view, absolutely, I think if we can get the support to include the 10,000 hectares, and that is why exactly what we're mentioning is that these long-term strategies are critical for South Africa. And we need more people to be jumping in and spending more money long-term on these projects in terms of expansion. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's wonderful that the community is there, and it's big to know. Obviously, from our point of view, we've got our hands full with our existing Lusco project, and that's why I said we want to sink our teeth into one thing and really make a difference. But we're always willing to consider projects. So if the question is like, are we willing to look at that 10,000 hectares? Absolutely. So if that was the intent of the statement, absolutely. And if we can provide more support, 100% to any tactical interventions. So we've also got to look at it that we're always willing to provide tactical interventions. So if you're not necessarily involved on the landscape side, we're always willing to help on the tactical side, whether it's, translocations, bringing animals in. For example, Babananga is a good example. We've just sent them lots of elephants from Addo. We've just sent them lions. We've sent them lots of different species, completely community-owned reserve. So we 100% support community projects wherever we possibly can. Whether it might not be with a fence, but if they can take elephants, we'll bring them elephants. We're busy now trying to find them hippos, duikers, so, species-specific stuff. The second point, I don't think the key focus area misses it. When we talk about landscape restoration, the communities are very much part of that landscape restoration. And the empowerment aspect of what we're talking about, and I know the white paper talks about utilization and how that utilization can benefit the people. But I think we've also got to look at the different funding models of these projects. So there's obviously projects that support the utilization, the sustainable utilization of resources. And there's obviously a funding model that gets applied to that landscape. But in our model, we don't do sustainable utilization in terms of hunting because our funding model just won't allow. Our donors don't necessarily support the hunting side. But that's not to say that there's no benefit for the people because there's no hunting. So there's always opportunities. For example, we've got a donor now that's looking at potentially buying a farm in close proximity to Loskop, a commercial agricultural farm, to create those jobs that we need. That there's not enough, that there's not necessarily too much pressure on job creation on the reserve. Because we also need to be frank, these reserves cannot possibly produce enough jobs for all of these people that depend on the reserve. So we have to look for alternatives. So like I say, we've acknowledged the fact that we've got these 3 communities as part of the reserve. And in fact, that is core to what we're trying to achieve. One of our core objectives is any decision that we make is about how to benefit these communities. And I also just want to confirm that there's currently a hefty debt that is outstanding to these communities from government that we as an NGO are settling on behalf of government to make the project work. So, just to settle the playing fields that they can get the benefit that they were promised long term. So that's 110% part of our mandate. So landscape is a landscape and people are front and center of that landscape.
Thank you, Dereck. So Gwena, let us know while you're speaking that the connection is not stable. I'm still going to try and unmute if he's comfortable with it. But his first statement was asking for engagement with Dereck beyond this. So
Perfect.
I do think it's a good idea to unmute if possible, because I know your connection is unstable.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Dereck, for a comprehensive presentation. I happen to be aware of the partnership we have with Loskop and MTPA, and we would like to engage with you on one of the community around Somkanda, which has recently approached us post the presidential launch of our National Biodiversity Economy Strategy. We are seeing synergies and alignment with what you do in the Loskop area. But I think we wanted to the third aspects as far as the people being central to conservation efforts. I'm sure that will be expressed on your programs and activities that you implement on the ground within that landscape approach. Thank you very much. Impressive work indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Just
much.
out of interest, if I can respond to that, we actually are working with Somkanda at the moment, which is very interesting. So there's one project that I can't talk about right now because it's a bit confidential, but we've actually sent Somkanda Tembe bulls. So they were a recipient from the Tembe bulls. We've sent them rhinos before. We've done a lot of work with Somkanda actually. So we'd be happy to talk to them. We know really them quite well. So absolutely, let's chat. We're in the middle of an agreement with them at the moment. So fantastic. And thanks for your input. We'd be happy to support.
Thank you. I think I'm just going to ask Mariette because it's now the second person that needs your email address, Dereck. So Mariette, if you can just share it in the chat, please. There's a comment from Emma Edwards who says, excellent work. Well done to all involved. And thank you for an informative presentation. There was also one from Sandra Hardy who said, such wonderful work. Very well done. And then I think it's 8 o'clock. I'm just going to ask one last question from the chat. And this is from Peterson, who says, what is the land use of the surrounding community and is it compatible with wildlife conservation? What are the challenges you anticipate or have running the conservation area?
So that's a good question because that's always the difficult thing with the expansion. And that's why one of those corridors are so narrow. We mentioned the 500-meter corridor because that's literally, there's a little valley between the 2 reserves and there's houses on either side. So we went and sat with the chief and we asked the chief if he can keep that corridor open for us. And he said he's not going to necessarily give any houses for that little block because that's all we've literally got left between those 2 reserves to get animals moving between. But generally speaking, that's the part of the beauty of this project is that the community land that is north of the reserve, we're going to go see Prince Matebe this weekend actually, and we're going to go fly around his property to look at this extent. It's really open. There's small scale cattle farming going on, so it's very unproductive, generally speaking. And he started with 10,000 hectares. Now he's like thinking, well, can't we give 15,000 hectares rather? So there's definitely, they've seen the potential of the bigger project, which is amazing. But generally speaking, other than the settlements, which are fairly widely dispersed through the area, there's a lot of open space. And that's why we need to catch it now. So we're frantically running around. For the first month, all we've done is go to speak to as many stakeholders as we possibly can to try and secure land around the reserve. And there's a number of reasons for that. We need to act now to get the land signed up, so that we can really start. And then since then, we've gone to get more funding, because obviously, we started with Loskop, but now it's become much bigger. So our funding needs are much bigger. So we have to, with a clear heart, go to funders and say, this is really possible. We're not just trying to talk about a corridor like that little diagram that you've seen there. It's like that you can go fence now, but we also need to be very careful on how we engage with communities, because it's about managing expectations. It's like a chicken and egg situation. You've got to talk about the project to get the funding, but you've also got to manage the expectations.
Yeah.
But yeah, so far so good. So we'll be taking loss from 23,000 up to 50,000 by the end of the year.
That's amazing. Thank you again. And another comment also from Karina, who says, congratulations on the Law School project, Dereck. Impressive work and presentation. We should have that phone call soon. And
great. Hi, Karina.
and then because we already passed the hour, I'm going to also ask, I think Johan has a question and closing statements.
I just actually like to, if to point out, if Peterson is the Peterson that I'm thinking he is from the Masai Mara College and regularly joining the sessions from Share Screen Africa, and it's wonderful to have him in, as he's probably going to play this to his students and the Masai Mara people learning from what we are doing here in South Africa. And last year we had a whole series of Masai Mara talks where the TUT students joined in. So it's wonderful to have this learning community, and it is made possible by many, many NGOs. I see Emmanuel Ngumbi was on here from the Giraffe Center. We've had them on. So a lot of these NGOs are really playing critical roles, really saving species. We've had many of them on. So, and you're not only standing in the conservation role, you're constantly standing in the fundraising role as well. So it's many hats that you have to wear to make these things work. So hats off to the fellow NGOs.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so important, Johan.
All right, thank you so much, Johan. There are many more compliments, and I hope I didn't miss any questions in the chat, but I think we are going to send those to you, Dereck. Like here's from Charmaine, who's saying, thank you, it's very informative and insightful. And from Carol Preston, thank you so much, Dereck, it's very encouraging. And I echo those words with her. So we say thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for taking your time tonight to speak to us.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks for all of your hard work, for all of you. Really appreciate it.